Forget the version of this story that makes you comfortable. Forget the polished image of a fearless warrior, standing tall, chosen because of strength, confidence, or proven leadership. That version is easier to believe. But it is not the truth. Because when God chose Gideon, he did not find a hero. He found a man trying not to be seen. And if you're honest, that's where this story starts to feel uncomfortably close, because it isn't really about Gideon. It's about what happens when someone who feels completely unqualified is suddenly called into something far bigger than themselves. Gideon was not in a field where wheat was meant to be threshed. He was not out in the open, where the wind could carry away the chaff. He was somewhere far more desperate. He was inside a winepress pit carved into the earth. Low, hidden, enclosed. A place designed for crushing grapes, not preparing grain. And that detail matters more than it seems, because it reveals something deeper than geography. It reveals fear. What kind of man threshes wheat in a place like that? A man who expects to be watched. A man who expects to lose. A man who is trying to survive in a world that has taught him hope is dangerous. Israel at that time was not living, they were enduring. Every year, the Midianites would come like an unstoppable force, sweeping across the land at the worst possible moment. Not when the fields were empty, but when the crops were ready, when hope had just begun to rise. And they would take everything, not some of it, everything. After enough seasons like that, something shifts inside a person. You stop expecting breakthrough. You stop planning for the future. You stop believing things can change. You adapt not to thrive, but to survive. And survival always shrinks you. It makes you quieter, smaller, hidden. That's where Gideon lived, in that quiet shrinking. And then, without warning, everything was interrupted. An angel appeared, not to a king, not to a priest, not to someone prepared, but to a man crouched in fear, working in secret, hoping not to be noticed. And the first words spoken were not comforting, they were disorienting. "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." That statement doesn't match the scene. It doesn't match the posture. It doesn't match the man. Nothing about Gideon's current reality reflects strength, courage, or boldness. And yet heaven speaks as if it's already true. Here's the first hook you can't ignore. What if the way God sees you has nothing to do with the version of you that you're currently living? Because Gideon doesn't suddenly stand up with confidence. He doesn't accept the identity. He questions it. If the Lord is with us, he says, why has all this happened? That question carries weight. It's not rebellion, it's exhaustion. It's the voice of someone who has heard the stories, but hasn't seen the results. Someone who knows what God did, but doesn't understand what God is doing now. And that gap between promise and reality is where doubt quietly grows. Gideon wasn't rejecting God. He was struggling to reconcile what he believed with what he experienced. And that's where this story becomes deeply human. Because doubt doesn't always come from disbelief. Sometimes it comes from disappointment. Sometimes it comes from waiting too long without answers. And sometimes it sounds exactly like this: where are you now? But instead of correcting Gideon, instead of explaining everything, God responds in a way that shifts the entire conversation. Go in the strength you have, not the strength you wish you had, not the strength you think you need, the strength you have. And then comes the line that changes everything. Am I not sending you? Suddenly. This is no longer about theory. It's personal. It's not about what God used to do, it's about what Gideon is being asked to do right now. And Gideon reacts the way most people would. He pushes back. How can I save Israel? And then he lists the reasons. Logical reasons. Real reasons. My clan is the weakest, and I'm the least in my family. In other words, I don't have the influence. I don't have the status. I don't have the ability. I'm not the right person for this. And if you strip away the ancient language, what he's really saying is simple. I'm not enough. Here's the next hook that hits deeper than it should. What if the very reasons you think disqualify you are the exact reasons you were chosen? Because God doesn't argue with Gideon's insecurity. He doesn't try to convince him that he's secretly strong or capable. He doesn't list hidden talents. Instead, he says something far more unsettling. I will be with you. That's the answer, not a change in Gideon, not an upgrade in his ability, just a shift in presence. And somehow, that is supposed to be enough. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it challenges the idea that you need to become ready before you move. Most people are waiting for confidence, waiting for clarity, waiting for proof, but Gideon gets none of that up front. Instead, he asks for a sign, not out of arrogance, but out of uncertainty, because stepping into something this big without assurance feels reckless. So he prepares an offering. Meat, bread, broth. He brings it out and places it before the angel, and then something quiet but undeniable happens. The angel touches the offering with his staff, and fire rises from the rock, consuming everything instantly. And then just as quickly the angel disappears. No explanation, no long speech, just a moment of undeniable confirmation, followed by silence. And in that silence, realization hits. Gideon understands he was standing in the presence of something far beyond him. And fear returns, but it's different now. Not the fear of enemies, not the fear of loss, but the fear of encountering something holy, something powerful, something that changes how you see everything. And instead of running, Gideon does something unexpected. He builds an altar, and he calls it, "The Lord is peace," not power, not victory, peace, which leads to another hook you shouldn't overlook. What if peace isn't the result of everything going right, but the foundation that allows you to move forward even when everything is uncertain? Because nothing around Gideon has changed yet. The Midianites are still there. The oppression hasn't lifted. The risk hasn't decreased. But something inside him has shifted. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to take one step forward. And that's how real transformation often begins, not in dramatic moments, but in quiet internal shifts that give you just enough strength for the next move. Because Gideon is still afraid. And what comes next proves it. Before he can confront an external enemy, he is given an assignment that hits much closer to home. God tells him to tear down his father's altar to Baal. Not a stranger's altar, not a distant symbol. His father's, his household, his environment. Which means the first battle isn't out there, it's inside everything that has shaped him. Everything that feels normal. Everything that has been left unchallenged for years. And here is the final hook that leaves the tension unresolved. What if the reason you feel stuck isn't because of the battles you're facing, but because of the things you've learned to live with? Because Gideon's story doesn't begin with courage. It begins with fear. It doesn't begin with strength. It begins with doubt. But somewhere in that hidden place in that winepress something started to change. Not because Gideon suddenly became fearless, but because he stopped running from the call. And that is where we leave him. Not as a hero, not yet, but as a man standing at the edge of confrontation, still afraid, still uncertain, but no longer hiding from what he knows he must face next. The real battle was never going to begin on an open battlefield. Not with swords drawn, not with armies assembled, not with the dramatic clash that most people expect when they think of deliverance. Because before Gideon could face the Midianites, he had to face something far more dangerous, something closer, quieter, and far more personal. And this is where the story turns in a way most people don't anticipate. Because the first command God gives him is not about defeating an enemy out there. It is about tearing something down at home. That shift matters more than it seems. Because it reveals a truth that is easy to ignore. Public victories are impossible if private compromises remain untouched. Gideon might have expected a strategy, a plan, a timeline for liberation. Instead, he is given an assignment that feels almost unrelated to the crisis. Tear down your father's altar to Baal, and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Not tomorrow, not eventually, now. And here's the hook that cuts deeper than most people are comfortable admitting. What if the greatest obstacle in your life isn't the pressure around you, but the things you've learned to tolerate within you? Because this wasn't just an altar. It was his father's altar. It represented tradition, family identity, cultural normalcy. It was something that had likely stood there for years, maybe decades. Something Gideon had grown up seeing, walking past, accepting without question. And now, suddenly, he is being asked to destroy it. Not adjust it. Not ignore it. Destroy it. Which means this is no longer just a spiritual assignment. It's personal. It's relational. It's risky. Because tearing down that altar would not just make a statement, it would create conflict. It would expose him. It would put him at odds with the very people he had learned to live among. And for someone who had spent his life avoiding attention, this was the last thing he would naturally choose. But here's where the tension sharpens. Gideon obeys, just not the way you might expect. He doesn't do it in broad daylight. He doesn't gather a crowd. He doesn't make a speech. He waits until night falls. He takes 10 servants with him, moves in the shadows, and does exactly what he was told, quietly, carefully, deliberately. He tears it down. And that detail is important, because it leads to the next uncomfortable truth. Obedience does not always look like confidence. Sometimes it looks like fear that refuses to stop you. Gideon was still afraid. The text makes that clear. He chose the night because he was afraid of his family and the people of the town. But fear didn't paralyze him this time. It followed him, but it didn't control him. And that is a completely different kind of courage than most people imagine. Not the absence of fear, but movement in spite of it. Here's the next hook you need to wrestle with. What if courage isn't loud, bold, and visible, but quiet, hidden, and deeply uncomfortable. Because while the town slept, Gideon dismantled everything that had been left unchallenged for years. Stone by stone, symbol by symbol, he removed what had been normalized. And then he did something even more significant. He built a new altar, not to Baal, but to the Lord, in the same place, with the same visibility, but with an entirely different allegiance. This wasn't just destruction, it was replacement, and that matters. Because removing what is wrong without establishing what is right leaves a vacuum. Gideon wasn't just tearing down false worship. He was redefining the center of his life. Quietly, intentionally, completely. And then morning came. And everything changed. Because what is done in the dark does not stay hidden forever. The people of the town woke up and saw it immediately. The altar was gone. The Asherah pole was cut down. A new altar stood in its place. And just like that, confusion turned into outrage. Questions turned into accusations. And accusations turned into a demand. Who did this? You can feel the tension rising. Because now this is no longer private. Now it's public. And when they found out it was Gideon, the reaction was immediate and severe. They went to his father and said, "Bring out your son. He must die." Let that sink in. Not correction, not conversation. Death. Because when deeply rooted beliefs are challenged, people don't always respond with logic. They respond with emotion, with anger, with defense. Because what Gideon destroyed wasn't just an object, it was something people had built their identity around. And now, suddenly, Gideon, the man who used to hide, is exposed at the center of conflict. Here comes another hook that shifts everything. What if stepping into your purpose doesn't make life easier, but more confrontational? Because this is the moment where everything could collapse. Gideon has no army, no influence, no protection, just one act of obedience, and a town ready to turn against him. But something unexpected happens. His father speaks. The same man whose altar had been destroyed steps forward not to condemn Gideon, but to defend him. If Baal is really a god, he says, let him defend himself. That statement changes everything, because suddenly the argument shifts. The people are forced to confront something they had never questioned before. If this god is real, why does he need to be protected? If he has power, why didn't he stop this from happening? And just like that, the certainty begins to crack. Gideon is not executed. He is renamed. They call him Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend with him. And here is the deeper meaning behind that moment. The thing that was once feared is now being challenged. The thing that once held authority is now being questioned. And the man who once hid is now standing at the center of that shift. But don't miss this: Gideon didn't plan this outcome. He didn't strategize it. He simply obeyed and let the consequences unfold. And that leads to one of the most important hooks in this entire story. What if breakthrough doesn't come from controlling the outcome, but from obeying the instruction? Because everything that happens next is built on this moment, this private obedience, this hidden confrontation, this willingness to tear down what others were unwilling to question. And yet, even here, Gideon is still not the confident leader people expect. He is still processing. still growing, still unsure. Because transformation doesn't erase fear overnight. It reshapes it over time. And now, as the external threat begins to gather again as the Midianites prepare for another invasion, Gideon stands in a completely different position than before. Not because he feels ready, but because something inside him has been reordered. The altar is gone. The false center has been removed, and in its place, something new has begun. But the question still remains. Can a man who obeys in the dark stand when the pressure becomes visible? Because what comes next will stretch Gideon even further, not just in action, but in faith itself. And this time, the test will not be hidden. It will be impossible to ignore. By the time the external battle begins to take shape, everything about Gideon has already started to shift, but not in the way most people expect. He has obeyed in secret, torn down what needed to fall, and survived the backlash that followed. Yet now the pressure moves outward, and it becomes impossible to remain hidden. The Midianites return, not as a distant threat, but as an overwhelming force, filling the valley like a shadow that cannot be escaped. This is the moment where fear should take over again, where every step forward should collapse under the weight of reality. But instead of retreating, Gideon does something unthinkable. He steps forward. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. And the man who once hid in a winepress lifts a trumpet to his lips and calls others to stand. It is a small act, almost simple, but it changes everything. Because that sound is not just a signal, it is a declaration that he is no longer hiding. And here is the hook that quietly shifts the momentum. What if the moment you stop hiding is the moment everything around you begins to respond? Men begin to gather from different tribes, different regions. They come not because Gideon has proven himself, not because he carries a reputation of victory, but because something about this moment feels different. Hope, long buried under fear, begins to rise again. And soon, what started as a single call becomes an army, 32,000 men standing together. On the surface, it looks like progress. It feels like strength is finally building. Like this is how deliverance is supposed to happen. But just as momentum begins to form, God speaks again, and what he says disrupts everything. The people with you are too many. That statement doesn't make sense. The enemy is still overwhelming. The odds are still against them. 32,000 is not excessive, it is barely enough. And yet God calls it too much, not because of strategy, but because of something deeper. Lest Israel boast, my own strength has saved me. And suddenly the direction of the story changes. This is not about winning the battle in a way that makes sense. This is about removing every reason to depend on human strength. So Gideon is told to make an announcement. Whoever is afraid may leave. No pressure, no condemnation, just an open door. And what follows is almost shocking. 22,000 men walk away. In a moment, the army is reduced by more than half, leaving only 10,000 behind. The shift is immediate, and the weight of it cannot be ignored. Because now, what once felt strong begins to feel fragile. And yet, even here, God is not finished. The people are still too many. This is where the tension becomes almost unbearable, because everything about this process contradicts human instinct. Armies are meant to grow, not shrink. Strength is meant to increase, not be stripped away. But what God is doing is not building an army, He is dismantling dependence. And here comes the hook that reframes everything. What if the things being removed from your life are not making you weaker, but exposing what you were never meant to rely on? The next instruction seems almost insignificant at first. Gideon is told to take the men down to the water and observe how they drink. Not how they fight, not how strong they appear, but how they respond in a moment of ease. Some kneel down, lowering their faces directly into the water, unaware of anything around them. Others scoop water into their hands, staying alert, watching even as they drink. And God makes a distinction not based on power, but on posture. In the end, only 300 remain. 300 out of 32,000. The number is almost absurd. This is no longer an army by any conventional standard. It is a statement, a reduction so extreme that victory no longer seems unlikely, it becomes impossible. And yet that impossibility is exactly the point. Because now there is no illusion left, no backup plan, no explanation that can credit human effort. And here is the hook that cuts through every assumption. What if God is not looking for greater numbers, but for a different kind of readiness? Even now, with everything stripped down to its bare minimum, Gideon is not suddenly fearless. The transformation is real, but it is not complete. There is still hesitation, still a quiet tension beneath the surface. And instead of ignoring that, God meets him inside it. If you are afraid, He says, go down to the camp and listen. That moment matters, because it reveals something many people miss. Fear does not disqualify you. It simply becomes the place where you must choose whether to move or not. So Gideon goes, quietly, under the cover of night, just as he once did when he tore down the altar. But this time, he is not going to destroy something. He is going to hear something. Inside the enemy camp, a conversation is unfolding. A man shares a dream, a loaf of barley bread tumbling into the camp, striking a tent and knocking it down. It sounds strange, almost meaningless, until another man responds with interpretation. This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon. God has given the Midianites into his hands, and in that moment, everything shifts. Because before Gideon has even attacked, before a single move has been made, fear has already entered the enemy camp. The battle is already changing, just not in a way that can be seen from the outside. And here is the hook that changes perspective entirely. What if the battle you're afraid to step into has already begun to turn in your favor? Before you even realize it, Gideon doesn't question what he hears. He doesn't ask for another sign. Instead, he responds in a way that marks a clear turning point. He worships. Right there, in the darkness, in the proximity of the enemy, before any visible victory. It is a quiet moment, but it reveals a profound shift. Because worship, in that context, is not about emotion, it is about alignment. Something inside Gideon finally settles. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to move forward without hesitation. Enough to trust what he cannot yet see. When he returns to the camp, his voice is different. There is no trace of the uncertainty that once defined him. Get up, he says. The Lord has given the enemy into our hands. There are no questions now, no hesitation, no conditions, just movement. The man who once hid in a winepress is now leading 300 men into a battle that cannot be explained, calculated, or controlled. Not because he has become fearless, but because he has learned something deeper than confidence. He has learned to trust. And this is where the tension reaches its peak. Because everything has been stripped down to this moment. No numbers to rely on. No strategy that makes sense. No visible advantage. Only obedience, presence, and a promise that has yet to fully unfold. The stage is set not for a battle that follows human logic, but for something entirely different. Because what happens next will not look like war at all, and yet it will redefine what victory truly means. Because victory has a way of introducing a new kind of danger, one that is far less visible than fear, but often far more difficult to recognize. Gideon has just witnessed something impossible unfold before his eyes. An army reduced to 300 men has scattered a force that once seemed unstoppable. The enemy has fled, the oppression has been broken, and for the first time in a long time, Israel can breathe again. Everything that once defined Gideon, the fear, the hesitation, the doubt, seems like it should fade into the background now. But that assumption is exactly where the next test begins. Because it is one thing to trust God when you feel weak. It is something entirely different to stay aligned when you begin to feel strong. As the Midianites retreat, the momentum continues. Gideon calls on other tribes to join the pursuit, and the scattered enemy is chased down, their leaders captured, their power dismantled piece by piece. What began as a moment of divine intervention now extends into a visible, tangible victory that everyone can see. And with that visibility comes something new: recognition. Gideon is no longer the man in the winepress. He is no longer hidden. His name begins to carry weight. His actions begin to define him in the eyes of others. And this is where the tension quietly shifts, because influence has entered the story. And here is the first hook that demands attention. What if the greatest threat to your purpose is not failure, but the way people respond to your success? Because the people of Israel approach Gideon with an offer that seems, on the surface, completely reasonable. Rule over us, they say, not just you but your son and your grandson. In other words, make this permanent. Turn this moment into a legacy. Establish a system where your authority continues beyond you. It sounds like honor. It sounds like reward. It sounds like the natural next step after everything he has done. But beneath the surface, something deeper is being offered: control, position, identity rooted in power rather than calling. And for a moment, everything pauses. Because this is the kind of decision that defines the direction of everything that follows. Gideon responds with words that feel right, words that reflect everything he has learned up to this point. I will not rule over you, he says. The Lord will rule over you. It is the correct answer. It is aligned. It acknowledges that the victory did not belong to him, that the power behind everything they just experienced was never his to claim. And here is the hook that feels reassuring but carries hidden tension. What is saying the right thing is not the same as guarding your heart from what comes next. Because the story does not end with that statement, Gideon makes a request, not for power, not for a throne, but for something that seems small gold. Earrings taken from the spoils of victory. Each man contributes, and soon a large amount is gathered. It doesn't feel dangerous. It doesn't feel like a shift away from what he just declared. But what Gideon does with that gold begins to reveal something subtle, something that doesn't immediately look like a problem. He creates an ephod, an object associated with worship, something that represents connection to God, something that, on the surface, appears spiritual, meaningful, even appropriate. And he places it in his hometown, not in a central place of worship, not under established guidance, but within his own sphere of influence. And slowly, something begins to change. The people start to gather around it. They begin to look to it, to rely on it, to treat it as something more than it was ever meant to be. And here is the next hook that shifts everything into a more uncomfortable space. What if the things you create after success become the very things that pull people away from what truly mattered? Because what began as a symbol becomes a distraction. What was intended to represent something greater begins to replace it. And without realizing it, Gideon becomes connected to something that starts to lead people in the wrong direction, not through rebellion, not through obvious failure, but through subtle misalignment. This is not the Gideon in the winepress. This is not the Gideon tearing down altars in the night. This is a man navigating influence, recognition, and the quiet pressure of being seen differently. And that pressure changes things. Because success introduces voices that were never there before, expectations that didn't exist before, opportunities that feel harmless, but carry weight over time. And if they are not carefully examined, they begin to shape decisions in ways that are almost invisible at first. Here comes the next hook that cuts deeper the longer you sit with it. What if the greatest danger is not turning away from God completely, but slowly drifting while still believing you are aligned? Because Gideon never declares independence. He never openly rejects God. He never positions himself as the source of victory. But the center begins to shift just slightly. And sometimes, that is all it takes. The story tells us that the ephod becomes a snare, not just for the people, but for Gideon and his household. Something that was meant to honor becomes something that entangles. Something that was meant to point upward begins to draw attention inward. And yet, life continues. The land experiences peace for 40 years. Stability returns. The immediate crisis is gone. And from the outside, everything looks successful. But beneath the surface, something has already been set in motion. Because what happens in seasons of peace often determines what will happen when pressure returns. And here is the final hook that leaves a quiet weight hanging over everything. What if the seeds of your next struggle are planted in the middle of your greatest success? Because Gideon's story does not end in failure, but it also does not end in the same clarity with which it began. It ends in complexity, in tension, in the reality that transformation is not a single moment but a process that must be guarded over time. The man who once learned to trust in weakness now faces a different challenge, remaining aligned in strength. And that challenge is far less obvious, but far more dangerous. Because what comes next will not just affect Gideon, it will affect everything that comes after him. The story does not end with the battle, and it does not end with success. Because the most revealing part of Gideon's journey is not how he was called, or even how he won, but what remained after everything was said and done. Victory had come. The Midianites were no longer a threat. The land experienced peace. For 40 years, there was stability, a rare and valuable season, where the chaos that once defined Israel seemed to fade into memory. And yet, beneath that calm surface, something quieter was taking shape. Because legacy is not built in moments, it is formed in what continues after the moment has passed. Gideon returns home, no longer the man in hiding, no longer the reluctant figure questioning his place in the story. He carries influence now, recognition, a name that people remember. And with that comes a new kind of weight, the responsibility of what his life will leave behind. But this is where the tension deepens, because legacy is not just about what you accomplish. It is about what you establish, what you normalize, what you leave for others to inherit. And here is the first hook that reframes everything. What if the most important part of your story is not what you achieve, but what continues because of you? The text tells us that Gideon lived a full life, that he had many sons, that his household grew. On the surface, it looks like blessing, like expansion, like the natural outcome of success. But there is a detail that quietly introduces complexity. One son, born to a concubine, is given a name, Abimelech. The name itself carries meaning. My father is king. And that name matters because it reveals something unspoken. Gideon had refused the title publicly. He had declared that the Lord would rule. But somewhere beneath that declaration, something lingered. Because names are not accidents. They reflect identity, intention, perception. And here is the hook that unsettles the surface. What if the things you reject outwardly still find subtle ways to take root inwardly? Because Gideon never wears a crown, but something of kingship begins to echo in his legacy. And when he dies, everything shifts. The stability he helped create does not hold. The clarity he once fought for does not remain. The people of Israel turn again, not slowly, not reluctantly, but quickly back to the very patterns that once enslaved them. They return to the worship of Baal, building new altars, restoring what had been torn down. And perhaps most striking of all, they forget. They forget the deliverance. They forget the struggle. They forget the God who brought them through it. And they forget Gideon. That detail carries more weight than it first appears, because it reveals something deeply human. Memory is fragile. Gratitude is temporary when it is not anchored. And here is the next hook that forces reflection. What if the impact you make is only as strong as what you leave behind for others to hold onto? Because Gideon's story was powerful, but it was not fully secured in the hearts of the people. It changed a generation, but it did not anchor the next. And into that gap steps Abimelech. The son whose name hinted at something unresolved now moves with intention. He goes to his mother's family, appeals to them, positions himself not as a servant, but as a ruler. And what follows is not just ambition, it is violence. He eliminates his own brothers, consolidates power, and declares himself king. Not by calling, not by divine appointment, but by force. And suddenly, everything Gideon resisted openly emerges through what he left behind indirectly. Here comes the hook. that carries the heaviest weight of all. What if the greatest consequences of your life are not seen in your actions, but in what others do with what you leave unfinished? Because Gideon's story is not a simple rise and fall. It is not a clean arc from weakness to strength to failure. It is something far more real, far more complex. It is the story of a man who was called in fear, who obeyed in uncertainty, who trusted enough to step forward, who witnessed impossible victory, and who then had to navigate the quiet, ongoing challenge of staying aligned. He was not perfect, but he was chosen. He was not fearless, but he moved anyway. And that is why his story continues to resonate, because it does not present an unreachable ideal. It presents a pattern, a blueprint that is both inspiring and cautionary at the same time. It shows that God does not wait for strength before calling someone he meets them in weakness. It shows that doubt does not disqualify faith. It often becomes the place where faith begins. It shows that obedience does not require complete confidence, it requires movement. But it also shows that success introduces new challenges, quieter ones, harder to detect, easier to justify. And this is where the story turns back toward you. Because somewhere there is a winepress, not a physical place but a moment, a mindset, a season where you feel hidden, overlooked, unqualified. A place where fear feels normal, where doubt feels reasonable, where stepping forward feels risky. And the question that once faced Gideon now echoes again, not as history, but as invitation. What will you do in that place? Will you stay hidden? Or will you respond to a voice that calls you something you don't yet believe about yourself? Because the story of Gideon does not end with him. It continues in every person who feels the tension between fear and calling, between weakness and purpose, between doubt and trust. And here is the final hook, the one that lingers long after the story ends. What if the thing you've been waiting for is already waiting on you to step out of hiding? Because everything began in a winepress, not with strength, not with certainty, but with a reluctant man who chose, step by step, to stop running. And that choice changed everything. Most people want the victory. They want the moment where everything finally makes sense, where the breakthrough is visible, where the story resolves in a way that feels powerful and complete. They want the trumpet sound, the collapsing enemy, the undeniable proof that something greater is at work. But if there is anything the story of Gideon makes clear, it is this: those moments are never where the story truly begins. It begins in the hidden place. It begins in the winepress. It begins in the quiet tension between who you are and who you are being called to become. Because Gideon was never the obvious choice. He was not positioned for influence, not equipped with confidence, not surrounded by opportunity. He was shaped by fear, by limitation, by a reality that taught him to expect loss instead of breakthrough. And yet, that is exactly where the call found him. Not after he overcame fear, but while he was still living inside it. And here is the truth that most people spend their lives trying to avoid. You don't step into purpose after you feel ready. You step into it while you still feel unqualified. That is the tension. That is the invitation. Because everything that followed the torn-down altar, the reduced army, the impossible strategy, the unexpected victory, it all traces back to one decision. Not a moment of confidence, Not a surge of strength, but a choice to respond, even when the outcome was unclear, and that choice is still in front of you. Maybe your winepress doesn't look like Gideon's. Maybe it isn't a hidden pit in the ground, but a season where you feel overlooked, stuck, or uncertain. A place where you've learned to keep your expectations small, to avoid risk, to stay where it feels safe. And over time, that place starts to feel normal, comfortable even. But what if that comfort is actually the very thing holding you back? Because the winepress is not where the story is meant to end. It is where it begins. And here is the question that lingers long after everything else fades. What would change if you stopped waiting to feel ready and started moving with what you already have? Because that was the turning point. Not when Gideon became fearless, not when the army gathered, not when the victory was secured, but when he chose to take one step forward, still carrying doubt, still feeling the weight of uncertainty, and trust that it would be enough for the next moment. And it was, not because he was enough, but because he was not alone. And maybe that is the part of the story you were meant to hear. Not the victory, not the numbers, not even the strategy, but the reminder that strength is not the starting point. Presence is. So, whatever your winepress looks like, don't ignore it. Don't rush past it. Because the place you feel weakest might be the exact place where something greater is already waiting to begin.